Hey guys, and welcome back to Not So Bible Scholar. Today we continue our series on Paul's Jewish background, and the last video that I did was pretty much me rambling on for 15 minutes about the idea of God being faithful to his covenant obligations, and how Paul kind of uses that theme in his language of righteousness and justification. And I mentioned that the idea of righteousness is more of a relational term rather than some kind of moral ideal or standard that really should be wretch. It's the idea of being in right relationship with someone. You are righteous when you have fulfilled your obligations within that relationship. And so to be justified would then mean to be in right relationship with God within your covenant obligations. So today we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. We're going to look at the book of Genesis, and we're going to look at the idea of Israel's vocation. And just asking the question, what was the purpose of the covenant with Israel in the first place? What's the big idea? Why did God approach Israel to be in covenant relationship with them? And so, before we start, I'd like to mention something that's been really, really helpful for me, and I actually learned this from an Old Testament scholar named John Sailhammer. He's got a book called Pentateuch as Narrative, and it's kind of a commentary over the first 5 books of the Bible, or sometimes called the Book of Moses. And it's the idea that when you're reading the Bible, and let's say you just jump into the book of Deuteronomy, right? And you should, in the back of your mind, be aware of what has happened in the story before the book of Deuteronomy, right? Everything is intentional. Everything is connected. There are words and phrases that should kind of, when you read them in the book of Deuteronomy, it should really click and say, oh, I've heard that before, say, all the way back in the book of Genesis. And it's those types of things that keeps the story moving forward. Because like I said, I think I've said it in a previous episode, the Bible at its most fundamental is a story. It's a narrative about what God has done in history and in the world. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. I think it's really helpful. But we're going to go all the way back to Genesis 1, verse 28, starting at verse 28. And even if you didn't grow up in church, everybody should really know these verses. It's Genesis 1. You hear about it. You hear people trashing it. You hear people talking about, oh my gosh, the world was created in, 7 days. That's ridiculous, and that's not up with science, and blah, 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 those sorts of things. But we're going to start chapter 1, verse 28, and it says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life. I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. So this is obviously the 6th day of creation in the book of Genesis 1, or in the chapter of Genesis 1, rather. And so this is God. You see this theme of blessing. You see this all throughout Genesis chapter 1. But in this instance, this is God blessing humanity. Right, so he has created mankind in his image, and he created the male and female, and now he's saying, I am blessing you, and I am giving you these things. I'm telling you to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue the earth or rule the earth. And this is another big theme that I'm not going to get into today, but it's basically sharing in God's authority over the earth. There's food and vegetation. There's animals for food and other functions. And so God is blessing all of humanity. And so this is a very big theme that comes up again and again and again all throughout the Bible. And Paul actually picks up on this. So if we go back to what I said earlier about thinking of the Bible as a story, right? If you know anything about the book of Genesis, and you kind of follow the story in your head, right? You have the creation of mankind. And then you have the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, and then they're expelled from the garden. Well, what comes after that? You have Cain and Abel, right? What comes after that? You have Noah and the flood. And then after that, you have the Tower of Babel. And you have these sequence of really bad instances, right? You have Cain killing his brother. You have the flood that basically restarts creation, right? And then you have the Tower of Babel where all of humanity is trying to build up to be with God and or to be like God, and God says, well, pretty much no, and scatters them all over the face of the earth. And so you have these string of really bad things after God says, I am going to bless humanity. So if you think about the story as a progression, right? You see creation as this good thing, thumbs up, right? And then you see the fall of Adam and Eve, thumbs down. Cain and Abel, thumbs down. Noah, thumbs down. Then the Tower of Babel, scattered all over the world, also thumbs down. And then all of a sudden we get to Genesis chapter 12, right? And this is a really key section for Paul specifically, right? And this is the story of God calling Abram, or Abraham. And starting at 12:1, so now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All right, so the progression of the story, we have blessings, God blessing mankind in Genesis chapter 1, and then a string of bad events, and then all of a sudden we get to chapter 12, and it's God approaching Abram. This is God calling Abraham. And then later on in chapter 15, we have the covenant of Abraham. And so this is God basically saying, look, I will make you a great nation, and that nation will have a great name, and you will be a blessing. There's that theme of blessing again. But not only that, there's kind of like a universal idea going on here. At the end of verse 3, it says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this is what Paul picks up as Israel's function, or Israel's vocation, because he knows this story like the back of his hand. And he's thinking about Genesis chapter 1, and he's thinking about the story of Cain and Abel, and Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And then he gets to the story of Abraham, and it's through Abraham and through his family, all of the families of the earth are going to be blessed. It's the story of blessing. And it is God trying and succeeding in the person of Jesus of blessing the entire world, right? So this was the original job, or the original vocation, the original purpose of the covenant with God and Israel, is that God wanted to bless all of mankind through that one family, right? So if you think about, it's kind of interesting to think about this idea, because if we go back to the episode where I talked about Israel being holy or distinct, or kind of marked out from the rest of the world, the idea of Israel blessing the people around them, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? They were to fundamentally be different or separate from the rest of the world. And through the rest of the world, or the peoples around them, seeing that holiness, seeing that distinctiveness, right? The rest of the people could come to Israel, and in turn come to God, right? Come to believe in the creator of the universe, and then they would be blessed through that family. It makes a whole lot of sense if you think about it that way. It's really interesting. And the idea of blessing ties this entire story together, right? So this was Israel's vocation. Israel's vocation was to be a distinct and holy people that would in turn kind of spread the blessings of God to the rest of the world. And so since we're talking about Paul's Jewish background, we obviously need to go look at some of Paul's writings, and we're going to flip to Galatians 3, 6 through 9. And Paul picks up on this idea, right? And he kind of turns it on its head a little bit. So let's do Galatians 3. We're going to start at verse 6, right? So Paul says, just as Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So you see, those who believe are the descendants of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believed. So, Paul is taking this story in Abraham, basically in Genesis 12 through 17, and he's kind of turning it on its head, and he's reading it through the Christ event. And he's saying that the blessings that the people of Israel, or Abraham would have been a typology for all of Israel, right? The blessings that were supposed to go to the rest of the world through Abraham is actually coming through Christ, which is a descendant of Abraham, right? So, and he actually goes on to say that, you know, that God declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham. So he's saying basically that a couple thousand years earlier, God basically told Abraham exactly what he was doing. He was blessing all of mankind through his offspring, right? And Paul kind of turns it on his head and he says, that's exactly right. Jesus is an offspring of Abraham, right? And so if you have faith in Jesus, you are one with Jesus, therefore share the blessings of Abraham, right? This was the original vocation of Israel, right? To bless all of mankind. Now it's being done through Abraham's descendant, Jesus himself. And so this idea, it comes up quite a bit in Paul, and it's very, very important for him. He uses the example of Abraham and blessings in Galatians, and then also in his big book, Romans, right? He uses that example again. And so it's this idea of the original vocation, or the original job of Israel, was to bless all of mankind. Now, Paul is saying that's kind of turned on its head and is saying Jesus, those blessings that God wants to bless all of mankind is actually coming through Jesus, which is the offspring of Abraham, right? So, it really helps us to understand kind of the effect that Christ has on the world, if you think about it, right? So, God's intention all along, to bless all of humankind, Jew and Gentile, right? And it's now through Jesus. It's because of the death and it's because of the resurrection that all of mankind really sees those blessings, right? And can receive those blessings that was promised all the way back in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, actually. And so it's really important. It's kind of an interesting topic to think about. And next week, I'll kind of be continuing on this idea of blessing, but this time it's going to be over Israel's failure of their covenant obligations, or their failure of their covenant vocation. So I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Have a great week.